Okay, so I am here with Person Online, and he has written a number of articles that, one of the, I think one of the most striking here to me was why I'm no longer a Christian loser and am now a vitalist Chad. So, for the audience out there, what precipitated that change, and why, should others follow you in that, or is this an optimistic shift, or is this kind of a pessimistic kind of uh, do you wish you could go back to being a Christian loser, as you call it, or are you not
Well,
looking back?
I wonder if you may have gotten the wrong takeaway from the article. I'm definitely still a Christian loser. The whole post is kind of a parody. I was sort of making fun of the whole vitalism thing. I was like, this is what this would look like if you actually abandoned like any tethering to traditional values at all and really ran with this thing. I did not actually change to become a vitalist. That is a very sarcastic title.
Gotcha. um, yeah. I, sup- I suppose that intuitively, to me, the way that I conceptualize that difference between, or the distinction between, vitalism and Christianity broadly, maybe not even specifically, but just to say, like, what is the essential difference between the two? Because I think a vitalist would also have criticisms of traditional Islam, or they'd have criticisms of Judaism, or they'd have criticisms of Hinduism, Buddhism, so on and so forth. To me, that there is a kind of left-right distinction there, or at least a collectivist versus individualist distinction. Do you agree with that? Do you think there's validity to that?
Well, I think there's two angles you could take there, but when you say collectivist versus individualist, are you saying that vitalism is more of the individualistic perspective, whereas religion would be more collectivistic?
Right. Yeah. Is that it?
Yeah, I agree with that. And the first article I wrote before the joke Christian loser thing, it was like 90s. What was it? What did I call it? Barstool conservatism is 90s liberalism. That was it. And I was basically responding to Walt Bismarck did this big post about barstool conservatism, which he seemed to be treating as sort of synonymous with vitalism, right? And my post responding to that was trying to figure out, what about any of this is actually incompatible with Christianity? And the only things that I could land on was like the usual touchstone cultural differences like casual sex, gay stuff, abortion. And other than that, it's like you could believe in all the rest of it and still be a Christian, and there's not really any conflict. And that's the core sort of criticism or issue I guess I've had with the concept of vitalism. Whenever I come across it, it's very ill defined. There's not a very well agreed on definition of like, okay, let's say I want to live my life as a vitalist. I want to be a really big vitalist every day when I go do stuff. What does it actually look like? I'm not sure. And I agree with your point that it's very individualistic in that way, that each person who identifies with this vitalism concept might go in very different directions with it. For Walt Bismarck, he seems to think that it's all about, screwing a bunch of mentally ill Jewish women on drugs and getting a lot of money, right? Like that's his vitalist idea. But then someone like Curtis Yarvin popularized this term. And I don't think that's how he would approach it at all, despite identifying with it. He has a very different aesthetic about himself. So I do agree it's very individualistic in that way compared to me as a Christian. I very much value the collectivistic aspect of Christianity in the sense that, yes, there are certain beliefs and norms I have to conform to have skin in the game in my church. That's something that I guess vitalism maybe rejects.
Yeah. One of the ways that I conceptualize this difference is that, um, I think, from the, maybe to give the devil's advocate here, I think the vitalist perspective, and again, we're already finding out that they all disagree with each other, so it's not really a coherent idea. But if I were to try to give it some kind of essence or core, I would say that, a vitalist might say something like, "Hey, the Norse Vikings 1,000 years ago were vitalists. They went on raids and they conquered foreign lands and they didn't, have this loser Christian mentality or something. And so uh, that is a clearly identifiable way of life, and it's clearly distinct from Christianity. And Christianity is basically, essentially, it's leftist because it's collectivistic, because it says you have to take care of the orphans and the widows, and the only type of war you should go on is a just war. You shouldn't just go to war to pillage people. And their argument would be that leftism is bad. Leftism has all these bad effects, and vitalism is the antidote to leftism in that sense. So they're coming at it from a perspective of this is almost like a metaphysical distinction. This is and maybe less metaphysically. It's the distinction between just individuals doing what they want, following their natural desires, like the desire for aggression, the desire for sexuality, the desire for pleasure. Their argument would be if we just followed those kind of genetically ingrained desires, society would be healthier than this kind of like Christian dysgenic welfare state, et cetera, et cetera. Do you have further rebuttal to that?
Well, there's 2 points on that. The first one is when we talk about, Christianity is leftist because it says we have to care for the poor and not just let them starve to death. That's sort of, I understand you're trying to play devil's advocate, but that goes back to the same problem of, can I find something written by someone who identifies as a vitalist somewhere who actually believes that or advocates for it? Like if I go to Curtis Yarvin's thing and I look through all his articles, I'm not going to find him writing anywhere that Christianity is bad because because Christianity tells you not to let orphans and widows starve to death. And actually, we should let orphans and widows just fend for themselves. And if they can't make it, too bad, so sad. I've never heard anyone that's quote unquote vitalist say that. And my guess would be that if you tried to frame it that way, a lot of them might take issue with it. I mean, maybe they wouldn't, maybe they don't, but I don't know. I've never seen that. Anyways, going on to the perspective you presented about just embracing natural genetic desires to follow aggression, for example, I would say it's almost ridiculous to put that forward without also saying you've got to be able to draw lines somewhere, because I don't think there's anybody that would say it's cool to just go randomly kill people and take their stuff because that's what you feel like doing, right? Like that's a crazy perspective. Another example is clearly a lot of people, for understandable evolutionary reasons, have an inbuilt genetic desire, men, for example, to have sex with very young women because women are often more fertile at younger ages. So if we just follow those genetic desires naturally, I could point to societies, as was the case commonly in the past, where women are getting married off at 12 and things like that. And again, I have a lot of doubts that people who are so-called vitalists would really want to defend something like that. They'd probably say, oh, no, actually, that's not what I mean. So that'd be my response.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that. So far, what I'm hearing from your response is you're saying vitalists don't actually believe those things. And I think Curtis Yarvin is a really, from my perspective, like, okay, so Friedrich Nietzsche, Ragnar Redbeard, BAP on Twitter. I mean, there are vitalists who will say, actually, violence is good, and actually, we don't, care about these moral concerns. And sure, let the poor people die. So the idea that those positions are wrong because no one actually holds those positions. I agree with you that they're a minority perspective. I agree that like extreme Rothbard libertarians are a minority, Nietzscheans are a minority. But just because they're a minority isn't actually an argument against what they're saying. And to be clear, like I've never described myself as a vitalist. But I guess I'm sympathetic where I understand some of their concerns, and I think that they kind of deserve a direct response, and maybe that's, I guess, some of the problem we're dealing with extreme beliefs. Like we could say that like real vitalism is an extreme belief. Like being a Viking is extreme. That's not really compatible with modern society. Being a Bronze Age warrior is not actually compatible with like holding a 9 to 5 job and being a taxpayer and so on. So these are things that are very marginal and they're very obscure. And I think one of the approaches you could just take is to say like, who cares? Who cares about these people? They're weird. They don't even really follow their belief. Like they're not going out. They're not serial killers, right? They're not conducting bank robberies. So it's all just a LARP. And I think that's one way to dismiss them. And the fact that I don't really write a lot about them would indicate that I don't think they're really worthy of writing about. But to that extent. But yeah, if I was to try to concoct a refutation, then it would be along. It would acknowledge that there is a core, there is an essence of true belief there. Whether there's hypocrisy in terms of how those people actually behave in their day-to-day lives, sure, I would be on your side on all of that. But I guess kind of what I was looking for is your perspective on. Let's put aside Curtis Yarvin for a moment and just say, if there was a Viking who was teleported, cryogenically frozen, teleported to the modern day, and he said, you know what, Mr. Person Online, your Christian ideas are sick. You're like an effeminate woman. You're not a strong Viking like me. My society was healthier. We were raiding and pillaging. We didn't have leftism back in my day. I mean, how would you respond to a person like that, I suppose? Maybe that's a fantastical example, but I think that would get more to the heart of the substance of the disagreement.
Sure. I mean, let's say hypothetically that happened, right? Like that dude would roll up and he'd be by himself. There'd be 0 people that would take his side, and everyone around me would all be willing to use violence immediately to stop him from enacting anything he's talking about. So my refutation would be, I mean, you lost on your own terms, right? The idea is, well, I'm just going to be violent and do what I want and take what I can. And the response is going to be that a bunch of people who are Christians and so-called leftists like me will literally just call the cops, and the cops will stop you using violence. So you'll just be held in check that way. It lost on its own terms. That's one way that I see it. Clearly, if we take this completely self-interested perspective, the majority of people have the collective preference that they would rather not do that, and they are willing to use violence as necessary to stop that kind of thing from being the norm in society. Your audio is cut out.
Sorry,
I can't hear you.
I messed up there. If your moral compass is that whoever wins a violent conflict is right, might makes right, then there's something true to what you're saying, which is that a collective of leftists versus a lone Viking is going to win out. And my response to that, and I think that's a pretty common argument against Nietzscheanism, but again, the devil's advocate trying to represent that position as they argue it would be they are not looking for some kind of a quantification or a glorification of a quantity of violence, in the sense of, sure, if you had a brave and glorious lion and you have 100 jackals, like the jackals can incrementally defeat the lion by nipping at the lion, and death by 1,000 cuts sort of thing. Or, you could have like a drone swarm or a nanobot swarm or something, or, yeast. You could have like some bacterial infection that, takes down some brave warrior or something. And they wouldn't argue in any of those cases that like, well, might makes right and violence is good. And therefore, I guess if, some yeast or some bacteria or some jackals takes down a lion, that means that, aesthetically speaking or morally speaking, they're in the right and they're superior. I think the Nietzschean position is that there is a value of the individual. It's almost, they have a conception of the soul of the individual. And there's this term in Greek, phusis. And phusis is sort of related to the growth of plant life, and it's used by Pindar in his poetry to refer to the substance of an athlete. not just in terms of his pure physical stature, but his like internal energy that generates like from birth. He has this internal energy which causes his body to grow, which causes him to be a great athlete. So it is almost a material phenomenon, but it's almost a precursor to our concept of heredity or genetics. So like a Nietzschean, I believe, has this concept of the individual, of the soul, of the personality, and their focus in their vitalism is saying what is beautiful is when you have a particular soul and it has this particular predatory nature and it's become a master of its craft, like, again, the beast of prey, the eagle, the lion, the cheetah. And it's this killing machine, but it's also, it has this unity of purpose and this unity of self. It has its own personality. Now, these are difficult things to define. Like, you know, I don't think Nietzscheans, they don't really use the term soul because that's a complicated thing. And then it gets into like, well, what is actually truly what is the essence of the soul? How is it distinct from the body? But that's my interpretation of their view on the world, is that when there is an individual that rises above the rest and becomes exceptional and is capable of violence and is powerful, that's good. And the fact that you can have a quantity of yeast, or you can have people with a 9-to-5 job can call the cops or so on, or you can outnumber somebody, that is not, oh, well, therefore you lost a violent conflict, therefore, you lost by your own terms. They would argue that the consequence of that loss is that is not disproving their aesthetic preference for individuals who are like highly powerful and glorious in their own right and have their own sense of sovereignty about themselves as individuals, whether that's, again, in the animal kingdom or among humans. Maybe it's possible to dismiss. I wonder if you have an argument against that, or you just think, well, that's just an aesthetic preference and that's silly and there's no reason to value that. But I think that would be their argument.
Yeah, at some level, it's true. You can't just argue logically against an aesthetic preference, right? If I say my favorite color is orange, well, what's your argument for why it shouldn't be orange, right? Like, that doesn't really work. I guess my first thought is to go back to, why is it not possible for there to be someone who is this image of a glorious individual who's risen above the masses, who has all this agency, done all these great things? I think people like that do exist and do great things in the real world under the society that we live in. A lot of them are Christians, perhaps not all, but or one possible example, Elon Musk, richest guy in the world, done lots of crazy things, has some of the highest agency out of anyone on earth. I don't think he's a Christian, but none of those facts about him are incompatible with Christianity. He could have done everything that he's done for the most part, maybe not the part about having 11 kids out of wedlock, but all the things he's done that matter really, while being a Christian. And none of that, it's not like the other Christians would all be sitting there saying, oh, how dare you try and build a colony on Mars? We Christians don't allow that. I don't really see that being the case at all. And then when I think also about, well, what then are vitalists saying that what is the glorified individual, accomplishments and conquests that individuals should be free to do that they're being held down from doing? To me, it's mostly things that do seem indefensible. If I think about someone who's not very violent and maybe they are meek and they don't stand up for themselves, and I compare that to someone who is very predatory, let's say, yes, a serial killer. I mean, who's a better person there? Clearly, the guy that's nonviolent, I think, is a better person than the guy that's like going and killing children. Even though the guy that's killing children, he's this powerful predator who clearly has a lot more agency than the weak little dude that sits at home all day. But there's no glory in that. The glory would have to come from having high agency and having all this power, and I'm so strong, and then using all of that strength for a noble purpose. If it's used, for example, to sexually prey on women, I guess you can have an aesthetic preference for that. We would just have a fundamental disagreement there, right? Like, that's just evil. That would get to a more I think fundamental arguments about the nature of morality and good versus evil, like that's the direction you'd have to go at that point, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. I I would again I to try to clarify or to specify, I think that example you gave, which is kind of like, in Star Wars, right? The prequels, episode 3, Anakin goes and he slays the younglings. And that's a pretty bad scene. I mean, that's a pretty rough scene. Um, so I don't actually think, though, Nietzschean vitalists would say that's their favorite scene of all time. And I don't think they wouldn't say that because they're like, engaging in the kind of behavior that you're describing, which is a sort of hypocrisy where you say like, oh yeah, we're vitalists, and then you actually present them with vitalism. They're like, oh well, not that kind of vitalism. But I think the distinction, again, in the same way that I described the lion and the jackals, and just because 100 jackals can take down a lion doesn't mean that the 100 jackals are more glorious or Nietzschean vitalists. Just because they win a violent conflict doesn't equate with that from that argument. In the same way, somebody who preys upon the defenseless and who's sort of like shooting, fish in a barrel, and just killing people in a way that is easy and doesn't require any challenge. I don't think that. I guess it's on a copyrighted term, so anyone can call themselves a Nietzschean vitalist, or someone could easily just say, well, that is Nietzschean vitalism. But I guess the more difficult argument to defeat, the more sophisticated argument would be that actually Nietzschean vitalism is not about preying upon the weak. It's about self-overcoming. And that process means finding the most difficult possible quest, finding the dragon and slaying the dragon. In Pindar, the heroes, the Olympians, well, I guess not the gods, the Olympians, but the people who are succeeding in these Olympic games, they're not succeeding because they're running a foot race against children and just smoking the kids. They're glorious in the eyes of Pindar because they're competing against the best athletes in the world, and this is especially the case in terms of wrestling, that it's men who are going toe-to-toe, not with somebody who's much lesser to them, but someone who's almost equal to them, and then it becomes this question of will and dynamic struggle. So I think that's what they would perceive as like the highest Nietzschean act, is not, killing little kids or something. It would be find the biggest, baddest warrior around and have this chivalric duel with him. Maybe chivalry is the wrong term because of its Christian associations, but I think that would be their response. Not that maybe again they might not really care. Like if you said, oh, but he also killed a bunch of kids, they might say, well, we're Nietzschean vitalists, we don't really care. But I don't think they would extol the Anakin Skywalker killing the younglings as the height of Nietzschean vitalism. I think they would say something much more like, a winner of the Olympic Games who competes against people of his own size, of his own stature, of his own power, and overcomes them and becomes the best. That desire to be the best, not by lording over weaklings and children, but by actually proving yourself against the best people in the world. I think they would say that's the ideal.
Sure. And if we take it in that direction, then that kind of goes back to my issue before, where it's like, well, where do we really disagree? Because again, we do all that stuff in the real world. In our current society, we have the Olympic Games, we have the UFC, where guys can go and get their teeth knocked out and all that, doing those sorts of things. And none of that's really incompatible with Christianity. I don't see any big, I don't do any of that personally, but there's tons of athletes that are Christians. Don't see like where, if that's the only observation that you're making and that's what you want to focus on in life, I think the Christian response would be, okay, you do you, ideally you're doing it within a Christian framework, but I don't see it as a big point of disagreement where Christians would somehow be like, oh no, you're not supposed to undertake that kind of struggle. No, I think absolutely God does call on people to undertake that kind of struggle, and a lot of people do it to glorify God. So yeah, I don't really see where the disagreement would be.
I think the disagreement would be in that, as much as they would probably enjoy watching the UFC and they probably enjoy watching the Olympics, although this year the opening ceremony may have turned a little bit of them off, but maybe they enjoy watching sports and they support sports and so on. But I think the Nietzschean vitalist ideal would be to say it's not enough to simply have a society where we allow some space for sports, but that actually this should be an all-encompassing supreme value of society, and not just at the level of sports, but at the level of warfare. So they would look back at the Trojan War and the Iliad and the Odyssey and say, this is the model for the ideal society. This is the model for the ideal warrior. The ideal life. And also in Norse paganism, the idea that the worst possible thing is to die a straw death, meaning, they had straw beds, so you die in your sleep as an old man. And the best thing was to die in battle. And then you would go to Valhalla, which was the highest realm that a mortal could achieve, where you just continuously fight other people and drink and have fun. So that is their ideal, is that it's not that, and I think they would say, hey, it's great that we have the UFC, it's great that we have the Olympics, but the ideal society is like Sparta. It's not just that sports are on the side, sports are like, we have a little corner for the sports people to go. It's like, no, every male should be subjected from age 12 to intense military training, and, only the best of the best survive. And then we have a culture, we have a civilization, to the extent that we could dispute whether that would be a civilization, but we have some sort of state